Hello, everyone. So this is going to be a little video guide for MLT716 curriculum and instructional design. And specifically, I'm going to be looking at giving you a bit more information about how to link your course designs to a particular academic professional context. So I've just got here the module learning outcomes, and you'll see that this is quite a thing when you're designing a course. Um, as you know, you've got a short course of study, 30 student learning hours. You're going to be kind of underpinning it with, ideas of what makes a good course. Um, those things are quite contextual. And so establishing, okay, actually, where are you designing this course? Who's it for? Who are the stakeholders? Is supremely important because it determines um, your aims and your constraints and your opportunities, right? So if we're talking about a particular academic context, then we're thinking, okay, what's your subject? What's the educational level? If we're talking about a professional context, then we're also thinking about, okay, within the subject, within the industry, within the workplace, are there particular, sort of frameworks or professional organizations and communities that have something to say about, what good courses should aim to do, how they should be designed, what limitations we impose on them, what should students be able to do at the end, all those sorts of things. So the way in which I'm going to tackle this video is actually through just one very specific example. Okay, so I'm just going to pick one academic context and then take you through like the specifics of that as a way of kind of modeling how you might go about linking your course to a particular context. But while I'm going to be looking at UK higher education, you could take the same principles of finding particular frameworks, thinking about them, thinking about your courses, mapping to those um, aspects of the frameworks that you need. You can kind of take that process and apply it to anything. So you could apply it to further education. You could apply it to an educational system or level in another country. You could apply it to professional education. Um, for example, MLT as a course is aligned with the occupational standard in the UK for further education and skills teachers, which is a professional set of guidance for what new teachers should be able to do. So a kind of similar process. And the point of this is that it both kind of gives you the information with which to design a really good course from. It shapes the kind of principles and theories of curriculum design that are going to be important. Um, but it also allows you to communicate and really explain the design of the course that you've chosen, the choices that you've made, in a more fluent and a more precise way to your stakeholders. So particularly when we're thinking about, working to a context, working to an academic framework, this is the audience of colleagues, the audience of educators, the audience of um, regulators and people that assure quality in that particular area. Um, it's useful in terms of the student experience because through doing this process can design a learning journey which is kind of more appropriate, more level appropriate, more um, the right kind of pitch of challenge to get them where they need to be in terms of a credited award. But ultimately, you wouldn't really share much of this information in kind of student facing guidance. This is for the back end, the kind of plumbing of the course. And it's something that will go into your community, how you communicate, how you kind of rationalize the course to informed educators and people that review education. Okay, so that's a bit about kind of why we're doing it. Let's look at how we do it. Okay, so we're going to look at first of all, well, we're going to look at three different documents concerning UK higher education, which is our example, right? So within UK higher education, there is obviously it is a sector. It's a large part of the UK education system, large part of the economy, and as befits most industrialized countries, it has oversight and kind of regulatory control through various kind of governmental and para-governmental bodies. So these people, the QAA, the Quality Assurance Agency, um, are and certainly were absolutely central to how we assure quality in higher education. And by that, I mean, how do we check that higher education courses are doing the right thing? How do we know whether something is higher education? How do we know that it's challenging enough? How do we know that it's focused on teaching the right things? How do we know that it's got good standards of assessment? All of those different things. And so what actually happened is the QAA used to be kind of solely responsible for this in the UK. That they're not actually a government body. They're a kind of professional body made up of um, teachers from higher education, academics, and kind of policy and administrative people from higher education. So people that actually work in universities getting together and saying, okay, what actually make up the standards of what we do? Okay. It was really highly regarded, really uh yeah, really kind of internationally recognized as very good practice. What happened several years ago, kind of in the last decade, is that successive governments wanted to bring control of higher education into the kind of political sphere. So they created a new um, government department, new kind of ministry called the Office for Students, the OFS, which you might have heard of, which is yeah, it's run by people that are elected or rather appointed by the government, so by elected members of parliament, right? So it is kind of directly controlled by the political system now. That being said, when the OFS came in and they started thinking about, okay, well, how do we actually evaluate whether universities and university courses are working? They found that task really difficult. And so, despite several attempts, they ended up saying, actually, everything that the QAA was doing is like way better than what we could do. And so we're going to continue using those frameworks. And so the QAA is still um, kind of like subcontracted to be overseeing quality, even if the frameworks and the documents that they lay out end up getting applied by the Office for Students. Anyway, that's just a bit of background, but perhaps interesting context for you if that's new for you. And similarly, if you're thinking about, a different academic or professional context, there's a different history behind it, and there's a different kind of like social and political context behind why there are these frameworks and these rules that might be in place. Anyway, let's actually talk about the detail and how you can use it. So there are three documents that I'm going to show you. The FHEQ, which is this one, the seek descriptors and subject benchmark statements. And they're all in increasing levels of kind of detail and granularity. So we'll start. This is the FHEQ, or in actual English, the Framework for Higher Education Qualifications in the UK. Okay. And what the FHEQ does is it tries to lay out what are all like what actually makes a qualification? Okay, what are the individual levels within qualifications? How do we decide that something is degree level or master's level? What makes something a doctorate, for example? And so there's an awful lot to these documents. As I said, these aren't necessarily written for students. In fact, these are definitely not written for students. These are written not even necessarily for teachers. These are written for people that design courses, for people that assure courses. And so there's a lot of kind of policy detail, right, that might be surplus to requirement for you. So one of the things I'd suggest is like don't read these documents front to back. That's kind of not how they're designed for our purposes. And so there are certain elements of each of these documents that I'm going to advise you to have a look at and to use. The same will be true for other professional or academic frameworks. So what what does this basically do? Right. So the FHEQ provides, as it says, the kind of national points of reference for, what actually makes a course, what actually sets academic standard to a particular level, with the idea being that we want, a degree, let's say a degree in music, to actually be pretty comparable, right? In terms of challenge, in terms of level, in terms of what students get out of it um, across the UK. You don't want like some educators, you know, let's say they're all charging 9 grand a year or whatever. Like you don't want them giving drastically different quality courses, right? Because then students are going to get, screwed over. It's a little bit unfair, right? So it's about having comparable levels of quality and of standards. Um, and so what they do is they set out, I'm just scrolling down. They set out, yeah, probably could have started lower down. Yeah, incremental levels of what makes, here's what we want, of what makes different yeah, different kind of levels of challenge in qualifications. So the kind of highest level in the UK, FHEQ level 8, so that's a doctorate, that's a PhD, educational doctorate, EdD, various things like that. You can see the numbers are different, right? So the numbers are different in Scotland. This is the Scottish kind of qualification framework. Um, and the numbers will look very, very different if you go to any other country. Okay, but they have comparability to some degree. Master's degree, so what you're studying on right now is level 7. That's FHEQ level 7. If you ever wondered like what the level is, it comes from this document. Okay. But equally, if you do a postgraduate diploma or a PG DIP, or if you do a PGCE, postgraduate certificate in education, or a PG cert, those are all also level 7. They're just smaller qualifications, but they're at the same level of difficulty. Then you also have levels 6, 5, 4, or 4, 5, and 6, right? Which are the different years of an undergraduate degree. So level 4 is first year, level 5 is second year, level 6 is final year of a 3-year bachelor's degree. Okay. And so that kind of just like makes sense. And so if you're designing a course for higher education, you will need to pick what level it is. If it's a credited module, i.e. student, it's contributing to a student's overall award. It's not just like extracurricular. Then you'll need to set the level of difficulty that it is. If you think it's going to come in second year, okay, it's going to be a level 5 module, right? And the reason that that's important is because these levels are obviously meant to be challenging to different degrees, to different extents. So these are the descriptors for level 4, a first year on a degree qualification, right? So you can see there's a little kind of summary and then some bullet points to say, okay, so people that basically finish first year of a degree that could be awarded a certificate of higher education, they should have demonstrated these two things, right? So knowledge of underlying concepts and principles in their area, the ability to evaluate and interpret them within that context they're studying, and then presenting, evaluating, interpreting kind of data, making arguments, sound judgments. Okay, so this all sounds quite academic. So remember that these descriptors, the other two documents I'll show you get more specific, but these two are meant to encapsulate any kind of higher education course, any subject, whether vocational education, whether super academic, you know, from like physics through to popular music. But it gives you a broad idea of okay, these are the sorts of things that people should do. And in particular, um, this is now level 5. You can see, okay, there's significantly more bullet points, right? So there's more stuff that um, whole people that finish second year should be able to do. And within the bullet points themselves, they get more detailed, they get more challenging. And so, in a way, you can kind of think about this as a kind of something like a Bloom's taxonomy of higher education course level learning outcomes, right? And actually, that this is one of the ways in which they get used. They get used to set and judge the appropriateness of the level of challenge of what students are, doing at the end of a course, at the end of a year on real degree programs. Okay, so when the BIM degrees got written, you know, the course level outcomes and therefore also the module level outcomes of, you know, first, second, and third years on a degree have been checked against this document. Okay, so for you, this is something you can do. I wouldn't, I wouldn't necessarily start here and say, but if you're writing a second year degree module, you wanted to slot it into second year on a degree, I wouldn't say like go here and try to build your learning outcomes off these, because these are really broad, really general, and quite jargony. And so I'm not suggesting you need to like copy paste, and I'm not suggesting that you need to like use the exact wording here, but there's a kind of interpretive comparison that you will need to be able to make. You'll need to be able to show that looking at the outcomes that you think are actually suitable for your your course and your topic, you'll need to be able to show and kind of argue that they're broadly at the same level of challenge and broadly looking at the same sorts of things as what's on a level 5. Okay. And then this goes all the way up, right? By the way, everything in blue is just the Scottish version because we're in the United Kingdom, of course. So it goes up to, level 6, and then after level 6 we have level 7, which is master's level, right? So this is even more detail. Then goes up to, level 8, which is doctoral level. Okay. So that's the FHEQ. So it's the kind of the this sort of foundational framework for what actually makes something degree level, postgraduate level, etc., etc. And so this is a pretty important thing that gets referred back to. Um, that being said, it's probably not the document I would do the mapping to. I just kind of wanted to show you to it because this is kind of where everything else then builds out of. Something that will probably be more useful is this. So this is the seek descriptors. So seek is just the sort of the sort of like the body, the group that was sort of brought in to do it. And these are more detailed descriptions of what goes into each of those levels. Okay, so 4, 5, 6, 7, and up to 8. And so within the descriptors, you can sort of go down. This document's not hyperlinked, but whatever. So as we'll see, the page I was on, these are just much more detailed. By the way, it wasn't on the FHEQ, but there is a level 3. So the idea is that level 1 is pre-GCSE, level 2 is GCSE level, i.e., like end of secondary school, and level 3 is college, sixth form, A level, BTEC level, right? So that's what this is doing. So if you're actually designing a further education course, you should probably go and use those frameworks. But they are actually contained here because it gives you that sense of, okay, this is what someone coming into a degree should have already done. This is the kind of level they should already be working at. And then you move on to level 4. This is now undergraduate first year level. Okay. And you can see this is in more detail. So there's a kind of, again, there's a very general summary of the kinds of things that a graduate at level 4, student progressing onto second year should be able to know, do, all those sorts of things. But then it details, and I quite like this, sort of splits them down by area. So kind of awareness of setting, awareness of context. So this is sort of knowing the context that you work in, your ability to be autonomous and work independently, take responsibility for what you do. Then you've got the category of knowledge and understanding. This is like knowing your subject. Then you've got a set of cognitive skills, so ways that you think about stuff, set of practical skills to do with practice and technique, some of which are transferable, some of which might be subject based, and then kind of more holistic kind of behaviors, moral values, those sorts of things. So yeah, awareness of ethics, personal responsibility, leadership. Okay. Um, and again, these are intended to map across any different subject that someone could take. But the key thing being that when courses get designed, they should take into account kind of all of this stuff. So um, I'll tell you what, if we take level 7 as an example, right, because you're on a master's, right? At level 7, by the end of your master's, in a way that it actually is appropriate to becoming a teacher, you should be able to operate in an abstract, unpredictable, complex learning and practice context as a teacher. You should be able to act autonomously to make decisions as a teacher. You should be able to have a systematic understanding of, how to teach, specialist theories of teaching, specialist kind of approaches to teaching and research. Um, and so when we designed Meltzy, we need to be thinking about helping you be able to do all of these things. We need to be able to make an argument that through the course, through the individual modules and assessments that we've designed, we're both enabling you to learn to do these things, and we're checking that you can do these things and that it's part of the assessment. Okay. So that by gaining the masters, by implication, you are operating at this level. But like I said, this has to be kind of interpreted, right? So this has to be placed in your own subject, your own kind of work context, all of the rest of things. this is the document I'd recommend that you use. So let's say you were designing a master's level module. Um, you want to be looking at, okay, I've got my module level learning outcomes, got my assessment. Okay, check those things. Are they working at this level of difficulty? Are they actually doing these sorts of things? So as an example, if I flick over to the multi-course handbook, right at the bottom in a kind of appendix, we've got this mapping done, right? So we have the same categories. We've got setting, we've got knowledge, understanding, cognitive skills. It goes on. And so we both mapped the module level learning outcomes to these, and shown you like, okay, let's say under setting, what helps you really explore and understand your setting? Okay, well, by doing your research project, investigating a specific topic, therefore it's a specific context. It's also doing so ethically, which would touch on the bottom, right? So an individual course or module outcome might map to multiple areas of the seek descriptor and therefore multiple areas of the FHEQ. I mean, the other thing that we've done very specifically, and this is quite common, is that underneath each of these areas, we've actually written our own version of what's in the seek descriptor. So here, under setting, we've got kind of two things, and these are kind of like learning outcomes, right? Well, we've written our own course level learning outcome, to be able to investigate the challenges, complexities of your professional wider setting, right? So that's a course level learning outcome that we're then mapping to the individual modules within it. That's all a lot and a lot of detail, and actually probably way more detail than you will need to do because you're not designing a very big multi-level course. You're designing a short course of study with about 30 hours of student learning. Um, so you're kind of designing like an individual module, right? So one of the things I would say is you should not be trying to show that your courses are doing all of these things. That would be completely unfeasible, and just not very helpful, right? Because you can't hit all of these areas in sufficient depth. This is what a student should be able to do by the end of an entire master's course, really. And so you can use it more to set and check the broad level of challenge, right? Not the scope, not how much you do, but the level of kind of difficulty and the level of broad area of focus. So I've just come off a tutorial with someone that is designing a level 4 module intended for a BIM degree that's looking at um, essentially academic assignments, kind of both um, writing and how to kind of write good assignments, but also, how to kind of communicate multimedia format assignments. And so thinking about it, it's like, okay, one of the first things that I advise to do is, okay, bin off the things that your module is not covering. So because it's designed to work alongside other modules, it's kind of helping students. This is again using the student's example. It's not intended to teach about music or about, film or something like that. It's teaching students how to write academic assignments for the purposes of getting a degree. So it's not really helping you with the setting of being, let's say, a popular musician or a filmmaker. It's not helping you with knowing about being a popular musician or a filmmaker, but it is helping with, say, some of the cognitive and the practical skills. Now, this is all still at level 7, but to save me kind of flicking back up to the level 4 thing, we sort of ran through and we thought, okay, the course is pretty much mostly about actually how you organize and communicate information. It's about how you articulate your thinking, your work within the purposes of an assignment. Perfect. By nature of that, it's also kind of about, analysis and evaluation. It's also partly about synthesis, creativity, problem solving, how you conceptualize and think critically. But it's like these four things are kind of like the things that students tend to be asked to do in assessments, particularly in writing assessments. So it's like we could say, okay, so this skill is pretty much what this module is focused to help students do. And that's like a perfect enough specific scope, right? So this is kind of the need to know. And then the module is also kind of broadly helping with these other things. Like you could make a case that other things would come up. but good to be focused. So, why is that helpful, being able to establish that? Well, number one, because you will want to check that, okay, the things that you've got in your learning outcomes, which is, what students should achieve by the end of the course, should be at the level of difficulty, shouldn't exceed it, and it definitely shouldn't be lower than the level of difficulty, um, than, the level that you're actually pitching the module. If something's at you know, second year on an undergraduate degree, you wouldn't expect it. And it would be pretty unfair if you expected them to demonstrate the kinds of skills that we say, a master's level learner should have. Right. So it's number one about checking difficulty. Number two, it's about giving you some of the kind of language, some of the phrasings, to kind of justify how your course would fit within an overall degree or an overall level, right? So going, say, back to the mapping, um, you might want to be thinking if you're say designing for a BIM curriculum, or if you're a staff member designing for, a sort of course and set of modules that you already know, you'll want to be thinking about how your module and how your module outcomes fit in, both to the, like I said, the general indicators of the level of study, the SEEK descriptors and the FHEQ, but also any course level learning outcomes, and also the balance of other module level learning outcomes that then contribute to that course level learning outcome. Okay, so this is where the job of multi-module course design gets more and more and more complex, and there's lots of moving parts and lots of bits of balancing. So it's perfectly fine to just state the level and the context that you're working in, and make the case broadly through mapping and through describing that you are working at the right level. That's enough. If you want to go on and you want to show, your kind of alignment and how you fit within, say, other modules of a very particular context, like, great, go and do that. That's really useful work. But that's not absolutely required for CID. Okay, the third third document I'm going to show you is something called the subject benchmark statements. So the previous two documents, like I said, are very general. They're designed to incorporate and apply to any different topic of a higher education qualification. Not just popular music, not just maths or, whatever. The stuff that is talking about, okay, what's actually specific to a subject, that comes up in these benchmark statements. And there's a lot of them, right? Because there's a lot of different subjects that you could cover. So this is the website from the QAA that kind of lets you search for all of these different ones. They're organized by date because they get updated quite regularly. So for example, art and design, as well as, like, sociology and whatever. And these are currently being reviewed and updated. Music was actually updated very recently. We also have communication, media, film, and cultural studies. There's also there's business somewhere as well. I mean, education studies is relevant for me, certainly. Yeah, business and management. There you go. And so sometimes courses like say the event management or the music business course might end up touching on multiple different subject benchmarks. So that's kind of fine. So there is a little bit of work in trying to position the topic of your course kind of within, the sort of acceptable subjects, just, the breakdown of subject knowledge in your area. Again, like, this is the one for UK higher education, but there would be a different breakdown of subjects at, school level or in a specific international context. So there you go. Okay, so this is the scroll to the top again. Sorry, this is the subject benchmark statement for music. So this was updated like last year. So this is actually really quite new. And so this again goes into much more detail, um, by level. So it goes through kind of level sport 5 and 6, but it's much more detail about what makes music. And it, like I said, sort of talks about the context and the purpose. So it sort of implies, but doesn't imply it. It says stuff about what the aims of a music degree are. It also talks about kind of what's included in when we say music degree. Well, that's could be classical music, could be world music, could be popular music, could be, musicology, could be music studies, not actually for musicians, it could be musical practice, right? So it's still trying to cover a whole load of areas, but it's laying out its terms. And then it's saying, okay, distinctive features of a degree, right, which is quite interesting. So the stuff around design and, quality assurance and review and stuff, I would skip all of that. Basically, what you're interested in is maybe some of the descriptions of, the typical content, typical ways that, typical things that are taught, typical ways that those things are taught, the forms in which the content is assessed, how feedback tends to happen, um, within a music degree. So it kind of lays out some broad descriptions of these things. That's quite interesting. And then the main thing is, okay, the actual benchmark standards. So if you sort of flip down, this document is helpfully hyperlinked. You can see that they sort of tell you some of the broad areas of content that tend to get looked at, right? And it's like these things aren't prescriptive. They're not telling you, hey, if it's not in this list, you can't teach it in a music degree. It's saying these are the sorts of things that tend to be included. And so if you find that your course is doing something really different, actually, to any of these documents I've shown you, that's not a deal breaker, at least say within the UK higher education context. It might be with a professional framework. But for these things, it's not a deal breaker. It requires you to argue why these things support or underpin or still guide students to successful outcomes within the context of higher education, within the context of the subject of music. Um, but still, like if you are from if your background is in music, you've done a music degree, you might read through this stuff and be like, oh yeah, this just sounds like exactly how my course was kind of communicated to me, how it was organized. Um, so yeah, it tells you something about teaching and learning, the kinds of activities that get used, etc., etc., etc. But we're interested, I guess, in the benchmark standards. And again, it's broken down by some of these areas. So if for some reason they don't use the same areas as the seek descriptors, I don't know why not. So there's no setting right now, but we start with knowledge and understanding. So then we've got, okay, at the end of the degree, so this is actually at the end of level 6, this is like what you need to scrape a pass because it's threshold. And then you've got, okay, on top of that, what do most students get out of a music degree? And so this is kind of an articulation of, what's in this category, just done very, very specifically to the topic of music. And then again, we've got technical skills, professional skills, etc. And so, like before, this is an opportunity to be checking the design that you've got, to be saying, okay, how can I describe the point of my course, the value of my course? How can I show that it sort of fits in and supports, the sort of aims and end direction of a full degree? How do I show that it's at the right kind of academic level? How do I show that it's broadly in the right subject? It gives you a way of positioning and kind of arguing for and justifying what you're doing. The thing I would say is one of the benefits of the subject benchmark statements is because they are um, much more in context. These actually might give you some ideas about your actual content, your actual learning outcomes. So, the FAQQ and the Seek, I think, are much more about kind of checking your work and making sure that your work is pitched correctly and giving you ways of justifying and arguing that it is. Subject benchmarks is kind of more gives you more ideas. It's more generative, maybe. I still wouldn't take because again, this is for a whole degree, so this is actually levels 4, 5, and 6. Don't think that your course needs to do all of these because, like, oh my God, you wouldn't be able to. This is still about kind of allowing you to make good discussions about how you link things in. And so practically, how would you go about doing that? I've just now flipped over to the kind of contents breakdown of a template that we give you for the course portfolios that you're writing. Where would you talk about these things? Where would you talk about the FAQQ, the Seek, the subject benchmark statements, or where would you talk about any professional or academic frameworks for your context? Well, you got a choice. You probably wouldn't talk about it in your scheme of work because your scheme of work is student facing. And I don't know about you, but those 3 documents we've just looked at, pretty wordy, pretty dry, and it's not the kind of thing that you want to be front and center. It's more like back end of course design rather than front end. Okay. So similarly, you might not want in your appendices, though you might want to do some course mapping to say the FAQQ or to if you're doing a module, then mapping of your module outcomes to the course outcomes or something like that. That actually might be in something you might include in your appendices. But in the technical section, there it will ask you, what's the educational level, which is FHEQ, when you're writing your learning outcomes for the course. Again, you want to make sure that, okay, they don't have to use the exact wording, they probably shouldn't use the exact wording of what's in the SIG, but they should have the same broad level of challenge, right? You should be able to argue that they ought to be interpreted at that level. Similarly, that the kind of assessment focus, level of challenge, the assessment node, excuse me, is also comparable with those frameworks. So maybe it might come up a little in this section. Um, it might actually be something that you kind of directly reference and refer back to, through quotation, through citation, in the narrative section. So when you're talking about the overall aims and vision, you'll be talking about, okay, if this is a level 4 module to help students. Yes, you can be talking about it from a kind of general like student perspective. Why might students need um, a study skills module in level 4? But you can also start using the language of, okay, well, how does focusing on those that practical skill of communication and organization, um, how does that allow students to be successful overall and hit those course level outcomes? How does it enable students to better articulate their kind of cognitive thinking in those other areas? So you can start kind of bring in this language in terms of your aims and vision, in terms of the rationale, the justification for why you're doing it. And when you say, quite literally, how does it relate to its academic context? Well, it relates because it's addressing this level of the FHEQ, it's at level 6, and it shows this. So you kind of are asked explicitly to map this stuff. Um, and I guess I'll close by just saying why that might be important to do or to learn. I mean, like we're asking it from you in the assessment, but like beyond the module, I care about it. Well, number one, because if you do any course design work and if you want to take and say pitch your modules to institutions or something, like this is demanded of educators and educational institutions in whatever sector they're in, um, because they get quality assured and evaluated by regulatory bodies like the QAA or OFS or governments or whatever. But it also just becomes part of the sort of the language, part of the discourse of being an educator is being able to draw on these frameworks as part of um how you argue, basically. And so one of the ways in which, say, the FHEQ might get used is uh, like not so much a tick boxy way, but in a way of kind of proving your point. Like it gives you a way of articulating and evidencing that something is appropriate, and gives you a way of both showing that you know what you know, and a way of fending off people that might have thorny or difficult questions. Um, so let's say, someone's asking, okay, but why does a music degree need people to really talk about essay writing? Why don't you just spend all of your time you know, playing your instrument? That's actually a common thing students might ask as well. But you might get an academic asking that, and you can say, well, yeah, it's all well and good thinking that music degree is about playing music, but if we go back to the subject benchmark statements and the FHEQ, there's a whole load that has to be about knowledge and understanding, right, and about cognitive skills, and actually some of these things of um, demonstrating your knowledge, the ways in which that gets expected, you know, actually that is quite academic, and that's out of our hands. That's set by the UK, um, basically the UK sector standards. So we need to do that, and we need to do that in a way that doesn't undercut students having all that really useful subject and kind of industry knowledge. right? So it gives you a way of talking about all the different moving and interconnected parts of whatever sector that you're working in. Okay, I know that's been quite a probably quite a long video at this point. Hopefully, it's been helpful. But just talking through, like, what does that actually mean to tie your course to its academic or professional context? And so, if you're working, outside of UK higher education, it will be finding, okay, in the space that I'm working, are there academic frameworks? Is it tied to an educational level? Is it tied to a particular set of curriculum standards? Let's say the secondary music curriculum, or if it's for a professional context, like is it actually should it be tied to a particular area of kind of like is there a professional body that oversees practice in this area? For example, the occupational standard for, FE and skills teachers, or for example, the International Coaching Federation, or, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Cool. So I hope that's been helpful. And let me know if you have any questions and want help about doing the sort of linking, the application, the mapping of your work to the sector standards. But I wish you all the best of it. Take care.